The word normal was used once, and it was used in reference to being not normal, meaning fatigue and so forth. I guess just I tend to go metaphysical, from an overview, while one's mitochondria might not be normal, while one's energy might not be normal, that doesn't mean as human beings and as human spirits and as wonderful entities of grace, we aren't all exactly who we are. And that is to be valued. And I know it's very difficult in some of these conditions and for all of us to just remember how very wonderful we are as human beings. And I would encourage you to take a moment now and again to think about that in the midst of, The other thing I wanted to talk about was hope. And what I have seen in a whole variety of parts of life, whether it's the uptake, believe it or not, of fax machines, I'm that old, or any other thing, is all progress is really incremental and sometimes almost imperceivable for a little while. There's just these little things happening. They're happening kind of out in the reaches, the very first movers around something, the most creative thinkers, the most risk takers. There's these kind of things happening. And then slowly momentum builds. And sometimes the graph goes like this, but there's all this energy down here, and then it starts to go like that. And this inflection point is reached of critical information, critical energy, critical numbers of people, and then progress actually kind of happens pretty fast. And there'll be companies, one of the things that I do and am interested in, and they're like, oh my God, this is like really successful, and I only just heard about it. And then you do your work, well, it's been doing what it's been doing for 10 years. And now it's really successful. And of course, the underlying point of all this is, it's easy to get discouraged, but there's a lot of things happening in this area, and there is a lot of energy. And while we may not yet be at the inflection point, we're moving towards it. And I think that's important to keep in mind. The other thing is there is almost total synchrony between the underlying messages of this morning's sessions, earlier this morning's session and the current session, because it's all about effective communication about something that's important to you. It's just the audience changes, but honestly, the techniques remain the same. So in this session, we're talking about advocacy. And of course, what were we talking about this morning except advocacy? We have two members of this later morning's panel. Rona E. Kramer was sworn as Secretary of the Maryland Department of Aging on March 13th, 2015, so a little bit after your fourth year, after being nominated by Governor Larry Hogan. During her time as secretary, she's focused on establishing Maryland as an attractive location for older adults through vibrant communities and supportive services. Don't we all need that? That offer residents the opportunity to live healthy and meaningful lives. Ditto on that. Secretary Kramer is a lifelong resident of Montgomery County, Maryland. She's a graduate of the University of Maryland, College Park, and the University of Baltimore School of Law. Comes from a long career in politics as well as commercial real estate development and management. In November of 2002, she was elected to the Maryland Senate, representing Montgomery County, and served for 8 years. Secretary Kramer is also a member of the Solve M.E.CSF Initiative Board of Directors and a driven M.E. advocate for her family member with M.E. And then we also have Emily. Emily Taylor is a Director of Advocacy and Community Relations for the Solve M.E.CSF Initiative. She brings to the organization over 15 years of policy, organization, and advocacy experience in both nonprofit and governmental sectors. With 5 years' experience on Capitol Hill, Emily contributes a deep understanding of both state and federal policy processes while cultivating strong grassroots organization and patient representation. Prior to joining Solve MES Initiative, MECFS Initiative, Emily served as the Director of Policy and Advocacy for an award-winning autism organization. She spearheaded major overhauls in disability, early intervention, and education policies. She's also a veteran of several successful, no one talks about the ones that weren't, electoral campaigns, where she trained others in effective social media and online organization. She received a BA with honors in politics and international relations from Scripps College in Claremont, California, I would add, and earned her M.A. in American politics from Claremont Graduate University. Emily draws inspiration from her mother, who has battled ME as well as chronic autoimmune and thyroid conditions since 1999. I would also add that we probably can't say enough about the skill and good humor with which Emily has organized the current program today, and I'm very grateful to her. So if Mrs. Kramer and Taylor would come up. We will begin with Ms. Kramer.
Thank you. Good morning. It's wonderful to be here with you. First, I have to say that I think that's my bat mitzvah picture up there. There isn't a wrinkle there, is there? Thank you. It's kind of like, you go on one of those dating websites, and you better not put up a picture that's going to make them scream and walk away when they see the real thing. I'd like to talk a little bit about what you'll be facing when you go to Capitol Hill. And for some of you who've been advocating for years, Diane, this is old stuff. But I noticed last year when I was talking to people before Advocacy Day that many of them said to me, "I'm so nervous. I'm really uncomfortable. I'm very nervous." So I'm here, first of all, to say, don't be nervous. These people that you're meeting with, the legislators, if we're lucky, and not just the staff, they were the nerds in school, just like the rest of us. So they just happened to have run for office and won a seat. It doesn't mean that they're brilliant necessarily. Some of them are wonderful, but they're just people. So don't be nervous. And frequently we'll be meeting with their staff, which makes your one step away. Now you have to be even more compelling because you've got to convince that staffer to make your point in briefing the legislator. So let me tell you, when you go in, what you'll be facing if you haven't done this: cramped little offices. It's only the senators who've been there for a long time who have big offices. So you're probably going to be crammed in with your little group with whom you're traveling in visiting these legislators. And you're going to have very little time to get your point across. And that means that you really have to organize your thoughts well in advance. So I would suggest that you determine the one point that you really want to make. What is the one thing that you want those legislators to know when you leave? And then work your way back into, how do I make that point very succinctly and very quickly? So come to your conclusion in your mind first. Where do you want to go? And make that point initially. And then give a few salient comments about it to work your way back into that point. For example, and this is what my point is, my daughter, who's now 26, has ME. And I want to make the point that ME devastates careers. I'm hoping that somebody else in my group is going to talk about some of the other points that we want to make. I can't make them all. I don't have that time. So I'm going to note that my daughter, when she was 19, moved to Israel and enlisted in the Israeli Defense Forces, the Israel Defense Forces, the Israeli military. She had a spectacular career going. She was loving it. This was where she wanted to be for a lifetime. ME intervened, and she had to leave. She could no longer sign her next contract to stay in. It was absolutely devastating to her. I'm probably not going to talk about all of the symptoms that she has. I might mention that she's in pain all the time. So she went from having a spectacular career to being in pain every day, most of the day. That's about it. I'd love to talk about all the other things that she did and all of the details of the problems she's gone into. I'm not going to have time to do that. So I want that one point to be relayed to the legislator, if I can't make that personally. I'd like for each of you, when you're meeting in your groups later today, to talk about what point they want to make. I'd like in my group for somebody else to talk about the effect on families and parenting. Somebody else should talk about the misery of having ME, the pain, the boredom, the loneliness. Someone else should make those points. The frustration of people not understanding what's wrong, of people saying, but you look fine. That should be made. That's an important point because these legislators and these aides are going to say, but you look fine. So someone should make that point. The discussion of laziness, all of those things that build into the frustration of this particular illness that other illnesses don't have to deal with. Remember that it's quality of your discussion rather than quantity. Don't go off on a tangent. It's so tempting. Here you are, you've come all this way to get to Washington, D.C., and you're using up all of your energy to do it, and you finally have the ear of someone who might be able to help us with funding, and you want to say it all, and you want to tell everything. Don't do it. Even if you think your hemorrhoids are caused by ME, and even though they are a pain in the ass, don't go there. It's a tangent. And I can tell you I heard a lot of those tangents. Stick to the subject because otherwise you're going to see eyes glazing over and your time's going to be up. So try to stay on point. I'd like to note that advocacy really, really does work. When I was in the legislature, I always told people who came in to meet with me to talk about their concern that what they were doing really matters. It changes minds. And we know just in the short time that I've been able to be involved in this great organization that new legislators have come on supporting funding for ME. Every single time we go out and we make an impression, it stays there. And that's so important. And this does work. And there's a synergistic effect that it works more quickly as we go, and it has a more powerful impact as we continue. So what you're doing is really important, and it does make a difference. And I would suggest that you continue making those contacts with your legislators when you're back home, because that's when they have time to really absorb. So, and Emily can talk to you about that and how we do that so that we've got a program that continues between these wonderful advocacy events that we have with Solve ME. Use visuals if you have them. Last year I took a picture of my daughter in her uniform getting ready to, in a plane, getting ready to jump. And it was to go from that to lying in bed. It's a visual, it works. Use those if you have them, whether it's a chart or whatever, and we've talked some about that. Visuals are great. They may ask you questions. The legislator or the aide that's meeting with us, they're going to ask questions. Answer the question directly. Again, it's going to be tempting to go off into a tangent. Don't do it. Control that. Just answer the question, and then maybe someone else in the group would also like to give their response, but make it short and succinct. Don't worry about what the other politics of the legislator with whom you're meeting are. Don't pay attention to those things. It doesn't matter if they're a conservative and you're a liberal, or they're a liberal and you're a conservative. It doesn't matter. We are here on a single issue. We don't want to get involved in any other issues with them. That would undo what we're doing here. So just focus on the fact that they're here and they could become one of our greatest advocates, regardless of how they feel about gun control. They could be one of our greatest advocates, and that's the one thing that we need to focus on while we're with them. I think that those are the most important things that I'd like to touch on, but I'm certainly going to be here this afternoon, and if anyone has any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. But most importantly, look forward to this. This is exciting. This is fun. Don't dread it. And it really, you're doing something really good and really useful. Thank you.
Well, hello everyone. Thank you again for the warm welcome earlier. Okay, it's on my notes. There we go. Thank you again, Rona. I think you did a wonderful job giving such a great sense of why we're here and the purpose that we fulfill. One I'd like to talk about a little more is really the power of what your experiences bring to advocacy, and why you being here and what you have to say is important. I'd like to start with a little exercise. One of my first classes in school when I first got into politics, the professor got to the front of the room and said to all of us as graduate students, "How do you change a law?" And all of us, well, of course, you pass a bill, you introduce a bill. No, you have to get your legislator to sponsor a bill. And we had all these discussions of all the greatest ways to pass a law. And he stopped, silenced the class, and said, "You have to change someone's mind." And that's where you begin. And as Rona said, you're meeting with a person, and you're talking to that person as an individual, and that's why your story can really move them. And this really ties into what we were talking about in the first panel, where Dr. Birch, sorry, gave such a wonderful example of those short snippets of descriptions that you can give to your doctor to very quickly encapsulate, even as a researcher, what that experience is like. And those same points are so valuable in the advocacy space. They're one and the same. Whereas a doctor is taking that point to understand your medical perspective, the legislator you're speaking to is there to discover what laws are impacting your daily life. So that line, "I can only do my laundry on it once a week in a good week." That legislator, whereas a researcher is hearing energy levels and mitochondrial levels and what genetic components, that's what a researcher takes out of that. What a doctor takes out of that is muscle control or energy levels or recuperation, restful sleep. A legislator hears at-home care, here's disability insurance, here's unemployment. And so each of those hear those contexts, but you describe it with the same short, beautiful sentence that gives that experience in a very few words. And so as Rona described, you want to make your single point. You want to stick to that single point. And so when you think about how you're going to communicate that, you work backwards. I'm going to borrow Rona's example. Rona discussed her daughter and the loss of career. So when I think about telling my mother's story, if that's the point I want to go for, I could go into how it took us 4 years to get a diagnosis and it's still not her diagnosis on paper. I could go into her multiple crash cycles. I could go into all the different terrible experiences that my family has journeyed through with ME. But I want to focus on that career component. So I'll shorten it to say my mother owned a small business. She employed folks. And when she was no longer there, she lost 4 years of a small business management, and her business was on the verge of bankruptcy because she couldn't be there to manage it. And in that short sentence, it's a piece of her story. It's definitely not a whole consumption of her story. And as Rona described, that temptation to go into all the different parts of your life, of your family's life, that are impacted by this disease is there, because these are all real experiences that we have suffered and gone through. But we want to tie it back into that point that you're trying to make specific to your legislator. And the other part of this is these folks hear stories day in and day out. They hear, this is the last time I was here, we were following on the tails of the Special Olympics folks, and so they come in so organized with like medals and all this stuff, and it's like it's me and Diane and our little packets, and it feels overwhelming because we are sort of the David to many Goliaths. But we have the power of our stories, and that is so wonderful. So when you are telling your story, you want it to create that impact, because again, we're trying to change a mind. So drowning in misery, as much as we all have been drowning in misery, is sort of what they hear every day. They know you're in the office because something's not right. You wouldn't be there if the status was all quo. So what you need to do is start with a piece of the story that they can relate to, and then pull it through and let it be honest, let it be genuine, but don't let it just be this drowning of negativity, because they get that day in and day out. So keep your story a balance of positive and negative, but try to keep it delivered in such a way that it's not confrontational, it's not sort of misery dumping on them, it's sharing that experience with them. And even if that experience is negative, it shouldn't be communicated in a way that is aggressive or negative towards them. And then the last point I'll make, and I know we have a lot of fun discussion planned, is that a lot of us have had a lot of varied experiences. I'd say the ME community is as diverse as any community I've worked with, and it's beautiful. But when you're communicating to a legislator, if you tell your story that's so hyper-focused on your experience down to your city block, it sort of takes away from the generalization, and you're one voter. So when you present your story, it has to be in a sense that it can be what I like to call the center of experience. So for example, my mom, as a small business owner, that can be compelling because there's a lot of folks that own small businesses. But if I get really specific, and she owns specifically a local editing house, and she lost contracts to the Hollywood studios or whatever it is, that we've already lost her. There's too much. So keep it in a center of experience. So for example, many patients have a post-viral onset. That's something very common that sort of everyone can pull from. But if your post-viral onset was very specifically a side nucleotide of mono that was that's never been tested before, that's not going to help. So draw it back to the center of experience, and make sure it's something. Ask yourself as you're telling your story: is this something others have experienced? And that's what you want to stick to. So while you're sharing your experience, even though we all have a lot of details and a lot of personal nuances that are unique just to us, ask yourself, is this an experience that others have shared, that others have experienced, and I, in addition to just speaking my truth, am I speaking theirs as well? And I'll just leave it there and go to our next part.
Since I'm taking the microphone away. Just have a couple short comments. One is about speaking to staff. Sometimes, again, if you've come all this way and you're spending money on a hotel and, you want to speak to the chief person. Well, it's not second rate to speak to the staff any more than it's second rate to speak to the nurse practitioner or, in my case, for instance, the associate in the venture firm. We have CEOs that won't talk to the associates. Well, if they're going to be rude to the associates, they're not going to be a whole lot nicer to anybody else. The point being, you talk to the person in front of you and you persuade them. And it may be their job to persuade someone else. And again, to be effective, talk to who you have. Because your behavior towards them, and I know no one in this room will be rude, but your behavior towards them will then be amplified and magnified as they take it to their principal. They'll want to do something good for you if you've treated them with dignity and respect. And I think just to amplify a little bit on your point about the ask and representing a community. We each sit there with a whole community sitting behind us that's invisible but present. And that's who we'll be speaking for in trying to make these points. And now, Emily, you get to be a bad advocate. Play completely against type, if you will.
So in this example, hi, Rona. We're going to pretend that Rona's a state senator, and I'm going to pretend that I'm going to be advocating for better Maryland-based medical education. So, and we're gonna talk about how I'm going to approach Rona. I'm gonna have a scheduled meeting, and Madam State Senator, well, I encourage you to react with me as if we were really in a situation where we were meeting with a constituent.
Hi, how are you today?
Hi, Rona. May I call you Rona?
You may.
I can't believe I had to wait so long to finally talk to you about this. It's been years that we haven't been addressed. So I'm just really glad you made time with me today. We represent a disease called ME/CFS, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome is just the worst name. Please don't use it. I can't even begin to tell you. Back in the 80s, the CDC held this panel, and they decided that they were going to name it this chronic fatigue syndrome. Everyone else in the rest of the world calls it myalgic encephalomyelitis. Oh, well, anyway. So I just really wanted to be clear that when my mom got sick, we went to 100 different doctors. I mean, oh my God, we drove from here to Texas, all the way across the world, and we just couldn't even find a doctor who knew anything about this disease. And she had one doctor that said she was bipolar. And did you know that they do that when you say BPS on a spreadsheet? It's actually a code for patient disease. Anyway, so on top of that, so then she got diagnosed with bipolar. Then she got diagnosed with Sjogren's disease, which is this autoimmune condition that can actually affect the glands, because she has some of that. But when she was trying to talk to these doctors, none of them took her seriously. And I think it was because she was a woman. Like, they just saw her as a woman, and they just didn't even listen to anything she had to say. So I just really want to really be clear that that we really need medical education.
And I've heard that before.
I've done that before.
Not from Emily. Many other people.
So, how Rona, feedback from you on just even the top 3 things that she did wrong?
Too much detail that wasn't necessary. You're going to lose your listener. She did not. When she finished, could you know what point she intended to make, if there were 1 or 2 points, or what she wanted me to do about it? Just as importantly, it sounded like a difficult story, but what was I supposed to do other than be sympathetic? And of course, she also spoke very, very quickly, and we're assuming that we're imparting information that our listener doesn't already know. Otherwise, why are we there? We want to give them time to synthesize that information. So when you're speaking, speak slowly enough that they're understanding whatever it is that you're saying.
Absolutely. So as I joked, I've been that advocate. I've had a lot of years to practice and get better. And I basically, as we were talking about this session, I went through a mental checklist of everything I've learned about being a good advocate, and then thought about how to break those rules. And it was kind of fun. But so one of the other things that definitely, as Rona pointed out, I completely missed the ask, except I just dropped it at the end and I didn't make it tangible. I purposely spoke very fast because that is one of my worst habits. And as those of you who have been on my webinars often remind me. And I think the other piece that's really important is the story was all over the place, as you could tell. And so as I spoke about before, piecing your story to the part that I wanted to speak about. And I think the worst thing I did, which I love that you were so gentle about, I exaggerated terribly. As much as I could probably say we've been to 100 doctors, it was more like 20. It just felt like 100. So being authentic, and I think that's one thing I've seen a lot is the instant you sort of lose one fact, you lose them all. So sure, I drove across the world, by the way, and all the way to Texas, which is again is not true. So being authentic and honest in that storytelling, and when you do present facts, make sure they're the right ones. And again, this is something that I so love about my job, that you don't have to be the experts. That's my job. My job is to get you the information that's right. My job is to make sure that I'm backing you up. And as Sharon so beautifully said, you have a whole community behind you. You also have our team behind you. And so if they ask you something that, what do you mean $9.9 million a year for this CDMRP program? And you're like, blah, 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 blah. My staff will get back to you. You have a staff now, guys. That's what we're here for. So don't feel like you have to be an expert, and then if you get caught in a corner, try to make something up. Just know that you can say, my staff will get back to you. And that will be there. And then just write that question down and let me know, let Erin know, let the rest of the advocacy team know, and we'll be there.
That's super. That's great. One of the things we talked about in the prep call was sort of like, we've talked about this sort of in your head, what you want to say. You kind of have a pretty good idea about your message and your ask, but you walk in and you sit down and your eyes go wide and a bit glazed, and you don't even begin to know how to get those first words or two out. How do you handle that? I'm sure it never happens.
Oh, no, never. Absolutely never. Yeah, all the time. So the best thing that I do is obviously I have my little notes in illegible scribbles of handwriting, but also, and this is something that you shared, which I was so inspired by. You memorize your first 3 sentences, your first 3 lines, and once you have those out of your mouth, you're rolling. You just got it, and everything else comes from the heart. So once you have those first 3 lines kind of set and you know what you're going to say, and again, this is where your prep work with your team really works well. So as Rona described, I'm going to talk about the loss of career. I'm going to talk about how my daughter, Rona's daughter, had this amazing career. I'm going to talk about how she got sick and how she lost it. I'm going to say she joined the military. I'm going to say she excelled greatly. I'm going to say M.E. cost her. And then once you get there, it just comes out. So just kind of learn your first 3 points, learn them well, kind of articulate in your mind how you want to say them, and then the rest will flow because, again, your story is your power.
I work a different way. I have to give a lot of speeches. I know my subject, but I don't try to memorize anything. I like bullets of reminders, just a single word to remind me if I forget something. I can glance down and that word gets me back in. So for me personally, I think, and a lot of people, when you're nervous is when your memory shuts down. So for me, it's much better just to have a few bullet points. Then if I need it, and I rarely end up needing it, but boy, it's secure to know, it gives you a secure feeling to know you've got it there, and you can just have the card in front of you.
2 small adds. One is whatever works best for you, obviously, is the thing to do. One thing I've noticed that I can be really eloquent in my own head, but there's this space, between my brain and then what actually comes out. And I think you were talking about your mother practicing in the mirror. Just saying it out loud, doesn't matter if you're talking to your dog, yourself, the mirror, it doesn't matter, but there's some tangible difference between being only in your own head and having your voice, having heard your voice say the words out loud. The second thing is, because you're working in teams, this is like super. Maybe one of you is a little more valuable than another, or perhaps more comfortable in the situation, or just likes to go first. You can decide what order you're going to talk in to some degree. You can also help each other out, much like we talked about in the appointment, of if one of you's kind of getting lost, you know, you can have prearranged, Emily, let me address that point, you know, and because Emily's gone off someplace. So you can coordinate yourselves. I mean, this is great. You're not doing it alone. Okay, you want to try it again being a good, effective advocate?
Will do. So we'll do the same scenario. We're going to address the same point. Secretary Kramer, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Good to meet you.
Thank you so much for your time today.
It's good to have you here.
I'd like to talk to you about how we can improve the medical education in the great state of Maryland, specifically about a disease that I'm very familiar with, myalgic encephalomyelitis, or known as ME/CFS. My mother suffers from this disease. She's been sick since 2008, and it took her 4 years to get a diagnosis. We saw doctor after doctor, and all of them gave her 100 different diagnoses under the sun. And in the end, the doctor who did give her this diagnosis said, "I can't put it on your chart." And in order for this doctor to find that diagnosis, it took her 3 months of researching after a 3-hour intake with my mother. So this is a very common experience. I know my mother's not the only one in the state of Maryland that's had this. In fact, I can show you statistics on how many people in Maryland have this disease, but according to the CDC, between 84% and 91% of patients are actually undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. So we don't even know how many people in Maryland are having this disease. And part of the problem behind that is that doctors don't understand it and can't diagnose it, which is why a medical education program would be so important to helping so many people, and even just getting a sense of how many people in Maryland are suffering.
Excellent. And then she would go on to say, Senate Bill 842 addresses this, and maybe mention the bill just a little bit. And then we'd very much like your support on that. Can you commit to that now? If not, could we follow up with you and give you any further information after you've read about it?
And who is the appropriate person on your staff to work with for such legislation?
Yeah, very good.
Thank you.
Good job.
So just a couple points on that. I'm so glad you followed up on what the specific ask is. And for those of you who are coming with us to Advocacy Day, we've actually created cheat sheets. You might have seen them in your bags if you've already checked in. And that's kind of like if you get stuck, we have 3 asks. I'd recommend dividing them up per person. So have 1 ask, and there's 4 asks because one is a part A and a B. So if you have a group of 4, maybe 1 person taking each one. And when you, again, tell your story, I sort of fumbled there. You saw, I was like, I don't actually remember how many people in the state of Maryland have this disease, but rather than try to guesstimate 500,000, maybe more, I just said there's a lot of people, and then we can always follow up with that information. And that was the one point that I think even in that moment I stumbled, but just kind of caught myself. The other thing you saw, I really made a focus to slow down. That's so hard for me. And then also, even if you do have a personal relationship, if you're in the business context, always refer to the person by their title. So even though I adore Rona, we've had lunch together, I really, really like working with her, I would still, if I were lobbying Rona, I would still call her Secretary Kramer. So it's always important to keep that professional context.
Good.
Do we have questions? Let's just start standing up, and then we'll get all of you. We have time.
Thank you. That was very informative. I come from a Republican state, North Carolina. A lot of entrepreneurism there. A lot of great, like Duke, Wake Forest. A lot of great research. When we went into one of our senators last year, what we heard from the aide was they were really kind of disappointed that there was all this budget cutting, and that's what the senator was all about. So I feel that we're asking for money in a time when there's across-the-board budget cuts. So that's one concern I have in going in. Another is we're Republican, there's Democrat. I don't see much compromise, at least not in the news. I know behind the scenes there's probably more friendliness, but I don't know how much they're going to be willing to sign on to more money. And, I did look at the letter. Sorry, I didn't get to send it off because of some other issues at the time. So I guess my question is, how to cross that bridge and get them excited about crossing whatever bridges they have to cross. And the other part of it is, I thank you, I want to call you Rona.
I've been called a lot worse.
Okay, no, that would not be me. But I wrote down, what is our impact statement? Because I've had training in entrepreneurism, had a small business, which I had to give up. And before that, I did a lot of international and domestic travel. Used to dealing with lots of different people, a lot of different cultures. So I hear now that, we need people to work. And I don't want to push us, because I know some people can't work. So it's kind of like a fine line. But I'd like maybe staff support. How has this affected people who could work, especially in North Carolina? I know there was a paragraph on the first page somewhere here. It said it costs individuals, the U.S. healthcare system, and our economy an estimated $17 to $24 billion annually, as 25% of patients are bedbound or housebound at some time in their lives, and estimated 69% are unable to work. I'd like to translate that to North Carolina. And what I see in my mind, and I have trouble expressing it, but I tend to be a more strategic person, is this is the nexus, the core, give me a lever and a place to stand. But outside of this, these congressmen and senators have constituents back in my home state who know people. I would love to lead something like this up in North Carolina, but I am physically unable to do it. And so can I ask them for links? And I know that was probably about 5 questions in one, and I apologize. But I want to ask for resources from them, who I can contact or have somebody contact, have the staff contact, if that's okay with you.
Ooh, there's a lot to unpack there.
I'd suggest you take the fiscal impact question, because Emily and I have been talking about strategizing. You are absolutely right. It would be very helpful for us to have state-specific information on people affected and fiscal impact, and even charts and graphs.
We actually do have that information available. Thanks to our partners at ME Action, they did create a full spreadsheet of every district-by-district breakdown of estimated prevalence and financial impact. That is available on the advocacy corner of our website. If you scroll down to that section that's information and resources, there's a link there.
Emily, I have it on my phone.
There you go.
If anybody needs it today for their information, I do have the spreadsheet on my phone.
Absolutely. So it's mobile accessible. So there is a spreadsheet, and I don't want to dive too deep into that because I don't want to take the thunder from our training that goes really specifically into what we're doing here this Advocacy Day. But I will touch briefly on it is hard asking for money in a time of fiscal uncertainty, in a time of fiscal cutting down, but it's always hard asking for money. Even in times of plenty, you're still elbowing for room at the table with every other ask that's out there. Do we fund education? Do we fund healthcare? Do we fund our security services? There's always a competition for resources. That's sort of the reality at which we live in. The difference is it just comes down again to changing that person's mind to political will. Does that person believe in your cause enough to fight for it in a budget hearing? And are they well placed enough to fight for your request in a budget hearing? And that's what really matters. And honestly, our requests in ME are very small. relative to a lot of other larger items in the fiscal budget of trillions of dollars. So I honestly think it's not about whether the budget's coming or going, whether we're expanding or contrasting as an economy. It's about what we need and we deserve. And we, as staff, translate that into very reasonable, real dollars. You'll notice in your congressional packets, it's a breakdown of what we're gonna use that money for. And how it's gonna make an impact. And so when you talk about pulling that through to what that means to your member of Congress, it's what that dollar figure does for their constituency. How many people will it genuinely help? If you can translate that into a real impact. So for example, if we're going with the medical education example, state senator, we're asking you for $500,000 to educate 30 different medical practices that treat a total of 75,000 patients. I'm making these numbers up, obviously, but that's what makes the difference. And again, there's only so much expounding you can do in that scenario, and it depends on the specifics of the legislation you're asking for. But it really comes down to impact outcomes. And so when you tie your budget request saying, even if it's non-specific, this amount of funding will expedite ME/CFS research. That's what it comes down to, and they need to care about that outcome.
Might I add, that money's going somewhere. And everybody else is out there asking for it. So there's nothing wrong with our doing that. It will go to some cause. The other point that I'd like to make is that what you're doing today might not have results tomorrow, but you're laying groundwork. And that groundwork will pay off eventually if we build enough of that groundwork.
And one of the asks is to be listed on the Department of Defense list to be able to compete for certain grants. Mm-hmm. There's no dollar, I mean, we have to earn those dollars, and so that ask doesn't even involve a budgetary ask. It's just a chance to compete on level ground with other diseases.
Actually, sorry, Diane, before there's one other point I wrote down, because you did ask 5 questions and I want to get on touch of them, but one thing that you mentioned was crossing party lines. And that is something that I think we definitely feel in our community. Our advocates are not just exclusive to ME. You are a person with ME. You are not a ME-defined person. You care about other issues that aren't just ME. And that can bleed over because we are all interwoven people, and you can be passionate about more than one thing. But when it comes to crossing party lines, you know, SMCI is not a Democrat organization. We're not a Republican organization. We're a disease organization. We are here to solve ME. And that's what comes first. And so as difficult as it can be, and I've worked with folks, I had one advocate, for example, who asked me, do you really want me coming? Because this office already knows me because I hound them on a completely different issue that I'm very passionate about, and I don't know if that's gonna corrupt your cause. And I said, is your family's experience with this disease real? Well, yes. Then that's what matters. Leave your other cause at the door. You're not here for them right now. You're here for us. So it's you can be, and this is one of in our other trainings. If you've joined us online on our webinars, one of the things I always say is, don't make assumptions about the staff member you're talking to. They may be working in a Democratic office, but in their core, of course, they might be a conservative. You know, it's oftentimes that people work across the aisle, especially when it's the insider trading of staff and offices. And so it's again, what we're talking about isn't about red versus blue. It isn't about rural versus urban. It isn't about rich versus poor. It's about people who are suffering. And it's about this disease and finding an answer. And that doesn't touch party lines.
Can you tell us where that spreadsheet is? We're looking and can't find it.
Okay, the question was, can you tell us what the spreadsheet is? If you go to the Solve ME/CFS page, which is solvecfs.org, click the Advocacy corner. And then you scroll all the way to the bottom. There's it says state. I forget exactly the name of it. State breakdown link. It says click here for a list of state breakdown. It's like the very kind of like bottom of the page.
We can address it this afternoon.
Yes, and that'll be also covered in our training this afternoon.
Just to add to your last point, the staff member you may be speaking to might also have ME or know someone who does, regardless of their politics, as happened to Emily and I recently. So you're probably going to cover this afternoon, but some of the members of Congress and their staffs are going to be completely new to the illness. So I wondered if you could touch either now or later on how much time to spend educating them briefly about basically the contours of the disease. And the other is that we often run into members of Congress who take the position that they don't want to tell the NIH or the health agencies what they want the experts at the agencies to choose what to fund. And we don't want to get into this situation where we're doing comparative suffering. You know, yes, well, our disease is worse for this reason, worse than ALS or worse than many of the other really horrible diseases, some of which are terminal. So I'd like to have you address how we might deal with that issue, either today or this afternoon.
Go ahead. I do think it's a great idea to give them some initial understanding of what it is we're talking about. So if you've got that planned out, please.
Absolutely. Well, from experience, when it comes to educating new legislators or folks that have never heard of the disease before, I find the personal stories are most impactful and kind of the fastest way to get the information quickly. And that's something that, again, your lived experience with ME becomes incredibly valuable. And as Dr. Birch mentioned, those short little segments that have a very real visceral impact that can be done very quickly. So for example, one thing I say with my mom, and if you've taken a meeting with me, you've heard this, is for my mother, recovered still means she's only 50% functional. That on her best days, she gets 1 day out of bed and 1 day in bed. And her life is literally halved. And that's sort of a very short way to describe a very real impact. And so, we're not gonna, especially with these folks, if we talk about, mitochondrial starvation, or we talk about, post-orthostatic intolerance, or, you start talking about symptomology in a broad sense, you're gonna lose them. And so keep it to your experience or your real impact. I think that's the best way to very quickly get a legislator up to speed. When it comes to the history of the illness, it's a bit trickier. It's hard to justify, when the illness was originally recognized in the 80s and the kind of long trials and tribulations we've had. And as many of you know, that is a difficult and turbulent story to tell. With a new legislator, you can't drop them in the middle of that pool in the deep end and see if they swim. You start with your impact and what happens to you, what you immediately can do about it, and then if they say, well, why hasn't something been done about this sooner, then you can baby step it. And I often use the analogy of advocacy is a bit like dating. And I'm not very good at dating, so I probably shouldn't use that analogy. But the first meeting is kind of like a first date. You don't immediately jump into bed with this person. You are feeling them out. What kind of music do you like? What kind of movies are you into? That's kind of what they're seeing there, is like, what's the nuts and bolts of your issue? Human suffering. Got it. Okay. What can we do? Dollars for education or dollars for research. Got it. Okay, start with the baby steps. And then you kind of pull them in so they knew what they're getting into bed with in terms of an issue that they're starting to commit to.
And I think one kind of overview response to, why isn't this recognized? Why isn't DNA HRT working on it? Is the has the advantage of being the truth. It's not a clear-cut disease. It has lots of signs and symptoms, and it has no one specific cause, so that makes it difficult for the scientific establishment to get its arms around it. And that doesn't diss anybody, but it's the truth. And therefore, we also need to educate the people at NIH and everywhere else, and we're counting on you helping us do that. That's how I would respond to that. Other questions? There's one in front here, very patient.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a quick question. How many minutes on average would each person get to speak for, just so that I understand how long I can kind of make my point and et cetera.
You all have scheduled, so I don't know how much time we've gotten on the calendars.
Generally, a congressional meeting will run about 15 to 30 minutes, ballpark. Every now and again, like the meeting Diane and I mentioned earlier, where we just kind of uncovered a staffer who had the disease, we stayed for over an hour. And they were willing to give us that time. But you can probably expect between 15 and 20 minutes on average. Usually they're set in 30-minute increments. So they'll sometimes try to get you out the door a little sooner so they can get back to their desk and do some emails. But I would plan like 15 to 30, target 20 kind of in the mid-marker, and then you can use more time as you need. It really depends on your group size. I'm so thrilled to say we have had double the turnout this year, which is fantastic. So we have so many wonderful people joining us, which means some of your meetings are really crowded. I think the California State Senator, or this California State, the two senators meetings are over 30 people each. So in that case, I wouldn't expect getting more than kind of like a handshake and a howdy do, because there's just so many people in the meeting. I think kind of meeting best practices is 3 to 4 people, and you take about 4 minutes each for each of your stories and your points. So as Rona so beautifully demonstrated, I'm going to talk about the loss of employment for M.E. That other people can talk about the other pieces of impact, but I'm going to talk about employment. And sort of build your story backwards to that. And again, this is why our sessions this afternoon are going to be so robust, and I'm really looking forward to having you all there. We have a 3-hour training with lots of breaks where we're going to go into each of those pieces very specifically for your work today, or tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow.
And it doesn't hurt to have a couple of backup points if there's extra time. You could find that you walk into one of your appointments and all the other people who were supposed to be with you got caught in traffic or didn't make it in for some reason. You're carrying the meeting. Make sure you've got a few extra points to cover those things that you think might have been covered by other people. So you're prepared with that. And you've got that on a card backing up your primary card.
Question?
First of all, thanks, ladies, very much for your time and efforts. We really do appreciate it. I know a lot of the questions that I personally have will probably come out in the training, so I'm not going to get into all of that. But just in general, one of the things that I like to focus on, because I've had a lot of years in sales and marketing, is whenever I'm talking to somebody new in the case, this is still sales. You're trying to get something from them. All these people you're talking to listen to one radio station, WIIFM. What's in it for me? So with that being the case, you have to find out what's going to light the fire under them that makes them want to talk to you and want to help you, because you have to find what you're going to be able to bring to them. And the information that I hope is going to come out of the training is a little bit of information about the individuals we're going to be meeting. Like, for instance, one of my senators is running for president, so I know that that's going to be on the back of his mind. He's looking for volunteers and he's looking for money and things of that nature. So I may try to skew, my approach along those lines. But in other cases, to try to find out, one of them's been in the Senate for many, many years. So he's very well established, not going anywhere, but obviously still wants to be able to do best for his state. And obviously, one of the keys that both you and Rona mentioned was about the fact of employment. With all of these people who are bedridden and obviously being misdiagnosed and being made sicker, if with all the education that we can do, we can help get a lot of these people back working, and that works for both parties, by the way. Both parties want to see more people working. So with that, so that's bipartisan. So from that perspective, I hope we can delve into that a little bit more during the training, because I think if we give them what they're looking for, they're going to be much more willing to listen to what we have to say. So hopefully that comes out of the training.
Those are good comments, thank you. And you bring up a very good point. It wouldn't hurt if you do a little bit of research, if you haven't already, about the individual with whom you're meeting, and you could say, I know that you were very significant in getting all of the funding that NIH has had for cancer research. And I would very much appreciate having those skills applied to the struggle to fund research for ME. So you know something about them, you compliment them on it, because that's significant, and you want those people who've done that to help us. So, and if you're doing research, I would suggest you share some of that with Emily, if she doesn't mind my saying that, because that's good for us to know too, to be able to use in the future. But take a look and see what they've done and see if we can find a way to tailor that to our needs and complement them. And as you've noted, if you're willing to be supporting them for some other cause or even their reelection, that's all very helpful. Just don't commit to it and not do it. But that doesn't hurt either if you've got someone. We went in and met with a representative, could I mention his name, do you mind, last year? Representative Jamie Raskin from Maryland, and discussed ME with him, and in this very short period of this last year, he's become a champion. And that's wonderful. We want to thank him for doing that, but now we know he's somebody we might want to get involved with in a re-election, depending on where you are on other issues. But those are things you need to think about, that we're continuing to plant seeds throughout the year. It's not just what we do today and tomorrow.
Okay, we have one last, hopefully brief question, and then we need to wrap up.
I just want to quickly note that SMCI is a nonprofit organization, and we do not endorse any candidates, just to be clear.
Thank you for all organizing this.
The IRS is listening.
Yeah. My question has to do with changing minds and actionable items. There are many things that need to be done in the CFS-ME community. There are many experiences we've all had. When we're going into the offices tomorrow, what specific actionable item will we be asking them to do? Will it be to sign, asking them to, if it's a staff member, to go back to the representative or senator and say, could you please sign bill XYZ? And then we'll have outcomes to see how many of the people that we lobbied actually led to the action that was desired. And also, we can tailor our experiences to the ways that that bill could help solve the problem.
Thank you. That was an excellent question. So when we get into the specifics of the ask for tomorrow, that's in the training this afternoon. So I don't want to, again, steal the thunder. We go very deep dive into exactly what we're asking and what the talking points are for each of those asks and how we're addressing them. But to speak in sort of a broader context, it's always good to have tracking, outcomes measures. You know, in some ways, it's political science. We do have measurements behind that. So that's where your meeting report forms become so valuable. You might have noticed, for those of you who've already, everyone jumped on the mobile tool, it was wonderful. For those of you who've already been looking at your mobile tool, there's a section there to add notes for every meeting, and we also have a full report form online that you'll use, and we'll again talk about this in much more detail in the training this afternoon, to put full notes and comments and questions and all of the things you observed in your meeting. When it comes to really quantifying that objectionable outcome, that's where it becomes more of an art than a science. As Rona so mentioned, Representative Raskin, we've been talking to him for years. And he's had a large presence. A lot of constituents, including some of our board members, have been working on him consistently, and it sort of just hit this breaking point when he was like, I'm in. So this speaks to the gentleman's point earlier of what was the acronym again? what's in it for me? That sort of is individual to the member of Congress, and some of them are looking for political gain, so they just want an easy win that's going to buy them votes. Some of them are really in it to help their constituents, and that's what matters to them. Some of them are playing party politics and just want whatever is going to fold them into best with their party of affiliation. So it really does depend on the legislator, and that's why the research is really important. And but again, we are, for whatever reason, the member of Congress is flirting with politics or is invested in whatever system of care they're working on for their own career. That's not why we're here. And it really needs to come back to that. You know, we are working with them because ultimately they work for us. And especially as a constituent, and some of you are matched up with out of sight of constituents, but you're representing a constituent. So for example, I'm taking meetings in Washington on behalf of my brother because that's where he lives, because our whole family's affected. So just because I'm speaking to somebody who's not per se my direct representative doesn't mean I'm not speaking with representation for what is the purpose. And so my brother, for example, like his vote's gonna matter in that district, and I'm gonna tell my brother what happens in those meetings. So he still works for my brother, and just because I'm representing my brother by proxy doesn't mean I'm not worthy of attention. So it really comes back to, you know, making your story compelling, making it so that it resonates with them, that it has some sort of emotional tug. And being clear about what we're asking for, and again, we'll get to that in the afternoon training, and most importantly, being genuine in your communication with them, and having that pull. And I kind of repeated myself a little there, but I hope that answers your question. And again, when it comes to the very specific asks, we'll be talking about that this afternoon.
Repetition is a very important part of communication, so no worries. A couple of things. While we obviously have no political affiliation, it's perfectly permissible to say there are so and so many million of us, we're a close community, and we vote, which is, you know, the whole point. We are coming into our last couple of minutes. As a kind of a very short kind of personal story, and it's about not being discouraged if tomorrow you walk out feeling like nothing has happened, because you may very well walk out feeling as though nothing has happened. Now, number one, you will have things to leave behind for people to look at, and number two, you kind of never know. When I was in a very unhappy job. I was finishing up business school, and for various reasons, people had said, you'd be really good in venture capital, that's what you should do. And a friend of a friend connected me with a partner in a major firm, venture firm. He took my call. The only thing I had to say to him was, my friends think I'd be really good in venture capital. Literally, that was the only thing I had to say. He was very polite, and it was not a long conversation, and I hung up the phone, and I literally put my head down at my desk, and I sobbed. I mean, those great big racking sobs, because I had my shot and I didn't have any bullets in the gun. But he said, send me your CV, so I did. 3 days later, a partner called me, and he was looking at a deal that was in my area of expertise and asked me if I would work with him, and I did, and 4 months later I was hired into this firm. So the point being, you never know. So leave the slick behind, be prepared with your reports to get follow-up so we can follow up in addition, and you know, it's back to the whole hope thing again. You gotta keep doing it. Do you guys have any final comments?
I think we've covered. There'll be more this afternoon, so you have other opportunity for questions.
Yeah, my final thought is gratitude, is thank you. I feel so touched to be able to share what I've learned in my career with all of you. I feel so humbled by you taking your precious energy and being part of this wacky event planning that I've been doing for and I know that it's such a strain, and I see that, and I recognize that, and I am awed by that. And finally, I've only been here for 3 years. I know that seems like a lifetime in ME terms, but I have seen such change from my first uncomfortable toddling steps onto Capitol Hill as an Emmy advocate to where we are now with a small army heading to Capitol Hill in raising the flag of ME with matching t-shirts and colors. And I mean, it takes a lot of coordination, but every time I pick up the phone, I see the impact. I don't know how to articulate what a difference we are making, and I thank all of you because we wouldn't be able to do it without you.
Good job.